They whispered behind her back, laughed when she passed, and rolled their eyes at the thought of her leaving. In a dusty little town where gossip traveled faster than the wind, she was branded with a name she never asked for, mail-order bride. But what no one saw coming was the quiet cowboy leaning against the fence, watching her with eyes that told a different story. Before she ever packed a single bag, before she could step on a stagecoach to leave it all behind, he looked at her with a steady voice and claimed her heart with just one word, mine. Emma's life had always been measured in whispers. The town she was born into was not cruel outright, but it had a way of weaving judgments into every conversation, slipping them into pauses like burrs in a horse's mane. People talked, and what they talked about became truth whether or not it had any roots. For Emma, that truth was always small, always dismissive, never the kind of story that painted her in light. Her mama had passed away before Emma had learned what it meant to be a woman, leaving her father to raise her alone while running the general store that sat on the corner of Main Street. He tried, in his own way, but he was a man of ledgers and broken crates, not of tenderness. Emma grew up with responsibility heavy in her hands and silence heavy in her chest. The other girls wore dresses stitched with lace, tied ribbons in their hair, and whispered about boys with bright eyes. Emma wore aprons dusted with flour and carried sacks of flour heavier than she was. By the time she was 19, Emma had a beauty she didn't believe in herself. Her hair was golden, falling like threads of wheat over her shoulders, and her eyes carried a softness that reminded some of rainclouds before a storm. But in a town like hers, beauty meant little if it wasn't paired with status. The ladies looked past her, the young men didn't linger, and though she was polite, steady, and gentle, she was not the kind of girl they thought worthy of courting. The loneliness stretched into her bones. It wasn't desperation that made her pick up the pen one evening but an ache so deep it begged for release. Sitting by the lamplight in her small bedroom above the store, Emma stared at the blank paper for nearly an hour before writing. Her hand trembled as she confessed her hopes and dreams to a stranger, one of those men who posted ads in the back of the newspaper looking for wives. She didn't tell him about her beauty or her skill with cooking or her faithfulness. She told him instead about her longing, to be wanted, to be seen, to belong to someone who would not glance past her as though she were part of the furniture. The letter was folded carefully, her name written in small script across the front. She sealed it with wax, placed it in the small wooden box on the counter, and the next morning handed it to the mail rider with hands that shook. That Tuesday, the rider tucked it into his satchel and rode off. Emma stood at the store's doorway long after the dust settled, wondering if she had just changed her life or made a fool of herself. By Wednesday morning, the whispers began. Someone had seen. Someone always saw. They say she's writing to one of them men looking for wives out west, the blacksmith's wife told another as Emma walked past on her way to the bakery. Mail-order bride, another woman muttered, her lips curled. Plain as day, couldn't catch a man here, so she's begging for one across the miles. Emma kept her eyes on the ground, clutching the basket in her arms tighter. Each word was like a pebble thrown at her back. She hurried on, pretending she hadn't heard, but the red that burned her cheeks betrayed her. The gossip grew each day, tangled and twisted with every telling. Men in the saloon chuckled over mugs of whiskey, betting on how long she'd last before she packed her bags. Women whispered in church pews about how shameful it was. The word bride was said with a sneer, as though she had purchased it the way she might buy fabric. Emma swallowed it all quietly. She didn't fight back. She had learned long ago that in a town this small, defense only fanned the flames. But there was someone watching her, someone she did not notice. Luke Callahan leaned against the fence post near the livery, his hat low over storm-gray eyes that missed little. He wasn't a man of many words, nor one given to town chatter. His ranch stretched wide on the outskirts, where the grass bent golden in the summer winds. He came to town for supplies, for nails or feed, sometimes a new pair of boots, and then left again, leaving little behind but a nod in greeting. People respected him, though they didn't know him well. But Luke knew Emma, or rather, he noticed her. He saw her when she carried flour sacks heavier than her frame should allow. He noticed the way she fidgeted with her shawl when whispers chased her down the street. He saw the courage it took for her to walk into town every day with her head bowed but her spine unbroken. Luke had his own share of scars, his own bitterness from a love that had left him years ago for a man with more money and less honor. Since then, he'd built walls around himself, walls no woman had crossed. But when he looked at Emma, he didn't see the laughter of the town. He saw bravery wrapped in softness, a spirit that had not yet been crushed, though the world tried. The first reply came 2 weeks later. A letter addressed to Emma, tucked into the mailman's satchel. She opened it in the back of the store, her hands trembling. As her eyes moved across the page, her lips curved into a smile, wide and unguarded. For the first time in years, someone had written to her as though she were valuable, as though she were worth knowing. That smile, the one she tried so hard to hide from the world, caught Luke's eyes as he passed by the window. It undid him in a way he hadn't expected. But the town's laughter sharpened at the sight of her happiness. The more Emma smiled, the crueler their whispers became. Soon it wasn't whispers at all but open mockery. Men at the saloon spoke crudely about what kind of man would send for her. Women clucked their tongues and said she was no better than goods bought and sold. Luke had listened long enough. The night of the harvest social, Emma had almost stayed home. She had dressed in her one good gown, pale blue with worn stitching at the hem, then stood in front of her mirror wondering why she should go just to stand alone in a corner. But something in her heart told her she needed one last memory before leaving. She walked to the hall, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her steps hesitant. Inside, lanterns swung from the rafters, music filled the air, and couples spun across the floor with laughter. Emma stood against the wall, her hands clasped, her eyes darting to the exit. She was about to slip away when Luke Callahan walked through the doorway. His tall frame cut across the chatter like a knife through butter. His eyes swept the room once, then found her. Emma's heart thudded. Surely, he wasn't walking toward her. Surely, he would pass by. But no, his boots carried him across the room, straight to where she stood. The hall grew quiet in ripples of surprise. Luke stopped before her, his eyes steady. He extended his hand. "Dance with me." The words were simple, but they hit her with the force of a thunderclap. Emma froze, searching his face for mockery. There was none. His gaze was unwavering, filled with something that made her chest tighten and her throat ache. Her hand trembled as she placed it in his. The whispers crackled like fire around them, but for the first time, Emma didn't care. In Luke's eyes, she saw something the town had never given her, belief. And as he led her to the floor, as the music swelled and their steps found rhythm, the world's cruel laughter melted away, leaving only the warmth of his hand in hers and the startling truth that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about where she belonged. The dance was only the beginning. Emma had never thought much about what it felt like to be seen until that moment, the moment Luke's hand had folded around hers and the eyes of the whole town had watched in stunned silence. She had stepped onto the floor expecting her knees to fail her, but his hand at her back was steady, and his presence, quiet, sure, unshaken, became a shelter she hadn't known she needed. The music swelled around them, the fiddles rising, the stomping echoing off wooden beams, yet she heard none of it. All she heard was her own heart, thundering, trying to make sense of the impossible. When the music ended, Luke released her hand slowly, as though letting go of something he wasn't ready to surrender. He gave her the faintest nod, tipped his hat, and walked her back to the side of the hall before the next song began. The whispers resumed, softer but still there, like smoke clinging to the rafters. Emma felt them, felt the eyes burning holes in her back, but for once she didn't shrink under them. She held onto the memory of Luke's hand, his gaze, the steady way he had cut through their judgment without needing to say a word. After that night, things began to shift. Luke didn't disappear back to the quiet of his ranch as people expected. Instead, he appeared, always in small ways, never making a show of it, but enough for Emma to notice. One morning, she came outside to find her father's creaking door repaired, the nails driven straight, the hinges oiled. She knew her father hadn't done it, and when she asked, he only shrugged, muttering something about a friend passing by. Later that week, when she set out with a wagonload of goods bound for a family outside town, she heard the familiar sound of hooves behind her. Luke rode alongside her, saying little, tipping his head in greeting, then staying with her all the way until she reached the farmhouse. He didn't ask for thanks, didn't linger long, just nodded once before turning his horse back. It became a rhythm. He appeared when she least expected, a shadow of safety at her side, a hand that fixed what was broken, a voice that calmed what was unsettled. At first, Emma told herself not to read too much into it. Men could be kind, but that didn't mean they stayed. Yet every time she caught his gaze lingering, something warm and unsettling stirred inside her. One evening, as lantern light flickered across the wooden porch of her home, she finally asked the question that had been pressing against her lips. Why do you keep helping me, Luke? Don't you care what they say about you, about us? He leaned against the post, his tall frame half hidden in shadow, his arms crossed over his chest. His hat was tilted low, but she could still see the glint in his eyes, the unshakable steadiness. His voice, when it came, was soft but carried the weight of truth. Let them talk. I don't care what this town thinks. I see you, Emma. And you're not what they call you. Her breath caught. She had heard so many names whispered about her, so many cruel labels stitched onto her back. To hear someone strip those away with simple honesty, it was like water in a desert. She turned her face away so he wouldn't see the tears threatening her eyes. But the town wasn't done testing them. Gossip, once lit, burned hotter than wildfire. When word spread that Emma had not only written to a man far away but also caught Luke Callahan's attention, the ridicule doubled. Some accused her of stringing along a stranger while toying with Luke's kindness. Others whispered that Luke was making a fool of himself for a woman desperate enough to beg for love. Emma felt the weight of it pressing down harder than before. She had promised the man in her letters that she would consider his offer. His words were kind, painted with promises of a homestead, of a new beginning where no one knew her past. It was tempting, especially when the town's judgment grew crueler by the day. Yet every time she thought of packing her bags, she remembered Luke's hand, Luke's voice, Luke's quiet conviction that she was more than their whispers. She felt torn between the safety of an escape and the fragile, terrifying hope blooming in her chest. The breaking point came one Sunday morning outside the churchyard. Emma had walked out into the bright sunlight, her shawl pulled close, when a group of women gathered near the gate stopped her. Their voices were sharp as knives, their eyes narrowed with judgment. You think you're better than us now, Emma. One sneered, running off to marry a stranger like you're some prize. Or worse, another cut in, her lips curled in disdain. Catching Luke Callahan's eye as if he's too blind to see what you really are. You've fooled him, but you won't fool us. Emma froze, her hands twisting the fabric of her shawl until her knuckles whitened. Words crowded her throat but refused to come out. She wanted to defend herself, to scream that she hadn't asked for their cruelty, that she had only ever wanted a place to belong. But her voice faltered, her chest tightened, and silence became her only shield. Then a deeper voice cut through the air like a crack of thunder. She doesn't have to defend herself. Not to you, not to anyone. The crowd stilled. Luke stepped forward, tall and broad, his presence commanding enough to still even the boldest tongue. He stopped beside Emma, his shadow falling across her as though he were a wall between her and the world. His eyes swept the women, cold and sharp, then softened as they landed on Emma. She's mine, he said simply. She's been mine since the first day I saw her walk past the livery with her head held low. And if any of you can't see what she's worth, that's your loss, not hers. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak of the churchyard gate in the wind. No one dared speak. The women shifted uncomfortably, their faces flushed, their power stolen by the calm certainty in his words. Emma's knees weakened, not from fear but from something far more overwhelming, hope. Her chest ached with it, her hands trembled, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe she wasn't foolish for wanting more. Luke saw her, not as a mail-order bride, not as the plain girl the town dismissed, but as someone worth claiming, worth standing beside. That night, Emma made her choice. She sat at her small wooden desk, lit by the warm glow of lamplight, and untied the ribbon around the stack of letters she had received. One by one, she fed them to the fire, watching the paper curl, blacken, and vanish into smoke. With each letter that disappeared, so too did the shame that had bound her. She was done searching for belonging in the arms of strangers. It had been here all along, steady and waiting, in the quiet strength of the cowboy who had always seen her. Weeks later, when Emma walked down the aisle of the little church in her pale dress, the same pews that had once carried whispers now carried silence. But she didn't hear them. All she heard was Luke's voice, steady and low, as he spoke the vows that tied them together. And when the preacher asked if he would take her hand, Luke didn't just say yes. He leaned closer, his words meant only for her, and whispered the only name that had ever mattered since the moment he claimed her in the churchyard. Mine. The town could whisper all it wanted, but it didn't matter anymore. For the first time in her life, Emma felt seen, felt chosen, felt truly free. And in Luke's eyes, she had all the belonging she would ever need.